The heart has its own circulatory system, so all of the tissues in the heart can't get nutrients and oxygen from the blood within the chambers because the walls of the heart are too thick. It would take too long for those nutrients to diffuse from the blood across all the different layers. So the heart, as I mentioned, has its own circulatory system, which there are coronary arteries that branch off the aorta, and those arteries carry oxygenated blood to the heart tissue. So those arteries branch and branch and branch until they form capillary beds that are associated with the tissues that make up the heart. After the heart uses the oxygen and nutrients in order to make ATP, which is energy, to contract, the waste products get drained back to the heart through the coronary veins. And that deoxygenated blood goes back to the right atrium, where it mixes with the other deoxygenated blood, where it's then sent to the lungs to drop off the carbon dioxide and pick up oxygen. Now, you may have heard of a heart attack before, and the more clinical term is myocardial infarction. And what happens when someone has a heart attack is typically one or more of the cardiac arteries delivering that oxygenated blood to the heart gets blocked. And it could be blocked by a blood clot or by the buildup of plaque inside the coronary arteries. And when those coronary arteries are blocked, the blood isn't able to move as freely into the heart tissues. And remember, the function of the blood is to carry nutrients to the cells so that they can make energy. So if the heart cells are not getting nutrients and oxygen to make energy, then they can't contract because the contractions require ATP to happen. And so when the heart is no longer able to contract, then the blood stops flowing throughout your entire body, and you can probably obviously see that there's a big problem with that. And the longer the heart tissue is without access to the nutrients and oxygen, the more likely the cells are going to die and the more cells are going to be affected. So it's really important if someone's having a heart attack to get them help right away so that they can hopefully stop the heart attack from occurring or continuing so that they can save as much heart muscle tissue as possible. Now, the muscle tissue of the heart is made up of cardiac muscle tissue, and the cardiac muscle cells that make up the cardiac muscle tissue are called cardiomyocytes, and so that's just the name of a cardiac muscle cell. And there's actually two different types of cardiomyocytes. Most of them are contractile cells, meaning that these are the cells that actually shorten or contract in order to pump blood throughout the cardiovascular system. But there are some specialized cardiomyocytes which are kind of more like nervous system cells or neurons because they help to conduct electrical impulses to the contractile cells. And these conducting cells are really important because the heart, the cardiomyocytes in different parts of the heart have to work together in order to produce an effective contraction that's going to push blood throughout the body. So the cardiomyocytes have to get kind of the same information to contract at the same time so that they can all work together to push that blood from one area to the other areas. Now, if we look at a cardiomyocyte kind of like underneath a microscope, so looking at it at the microscopic level here, first of all, the cells are branching. So you see how this one looks kind of like an X shape here? And that X shape helps this cell to communicate with more than one cell around it. And this is important because when this cell gets the signal to contract, all the cells around it need to get that same signal at the same time. And that helps them to all contract together to work together to push that blood. Because one cell is not going to be very effective at pushing very much blood, but thousands or millions of cells working together is going to be more efficient or more effective at moving that blood where it needs to go. There are striations it's kind of hard to see on the picture here, but the striations are due to the arrangement of actin and myosin. So think back to the skeletal muscle and how the skeletal muscle contracts, and cardiac muscle contracts in a very similar way, where myosin and actin arranged in sarcomeres slide across each other in order to make the cell shorten with force. And so just like skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle has the same striped appearance associated with those thin and thick filaments. Calcium is needed for contractions to occur. And in general, the heart has slower contractions than skeletal muscle. And this is because the contraction needs to be kind of slow and steady in order to effectively push that blood from one area to another area. Also, between adjacent cardiomyocytes, there are these structures called intercalated discs. And these intercalated discs kind of serve two functions. One is that they have desmosomes, and desmosomes are proteins that help to hold these two cells tightly together. So that helps these cells not break apart as they are contracting and pushing against fluid, because it takes a lot of pressure to move fluid. Also in these gap junctions, there are things called, also in these intercalated discs, there are things called gap junctions. And the gap junctions allow the cytoplasm from one cell to mix with the cytoplasm with an adjacent cell. And that helps this cell kind of share the signal with this cell so that these cells can contract at the same time. So when depolarization occurs with an action potential and sodium and calcium rushes into this cell in order to tell it to contract, this adjacent cell also gets those ions, which help to trigger it to contract as well. So you can imagine, think about if your car gets stuck in the mud and you have maybe 4 people that are helping you push the car out, but if they're not all pushing at the same time, then they're not really being very effective at pushing your car out of the mud. But if you all push at the same time, then all of your force together can more effectively push the car out of the mud. And that's kind of how these cardiomyocytes work. One cardiomyocyte is not going to be very effective at pushing blood very far, but when you have a whole bunch of them that are attached to each other, that are sharing the signal to contract, it helps to more effectively move that blood throughout the body and throughout the cardiovascular system.